The conference room fell silent the moment Mason Rourke placed a tiny steel bolt on the polished table. It was barely an inch long, worth less than $1 at any hardware store, yet every engineer in the room knew he had just stopped the launch of Titan Dynamics' most important defense project in company history. Military officers glanced at one another in confusion while television cameras continued rolling. Standing at the front of the room, CEO Cassandra Whitmore folded her arms and smiled with open contempt. "You're delaying $1 billion program over a $1 bolt," she asked, loud enough for every executive reporter and Defense Department official to hear. Mason didn't flinch. After 20 years inspecting military aircraft, he recognized the difference instantly. The bolt installed inside the prototype wasn't military grade. It was a commercial substitute that could fracture under extreme stress. He calmly explained that one failed fastener could destroy the aircraft, kill its test pilot, and compromise national security. Cassandra laughed, calling him paranoid and accusing him of sabotaging months of work because of an obsession with meaningless details. Applause and nervous laughter echoed through the room as she demanded he sign the inspection certificate immediately. Mason slowly slid the unsigned document back across the table. "I won't approve a lie," he said. "If this aircraft flies today, someone may never come home." Furious Cassandra fired him on the spot, ordered security to escort him out of the building, and publicly declared that Titan Dynamics would no longer tolerate employees who stood in the way of progress. Carrying nothing but a cardboard box and the rejected inspection report, Mason walked out of the factory while cameras captured what looked like the humiliating end of an insignificant quality inspector's career. 3 days later, during the nationally televised flight demonstration, the prototype climbed flawlessly into the sky before suddenly breaking apart in midair. The pilot barely escaped with his life. Within hours, federal investigators arrived. The company's $1.2 billion defense contract was frozen, and someone quietly recovered Mason's forgotten inspection report from the archives. But if Mason had been right all along, who had ordered the military-grade bolt to be replaced with a $1 counterfeit, and how high inside Titan Dynamics did the conspiracy really reach? Before dawn painted the eastern sky, a single light was already glowing inside a modest brick house on the outskirts of Arlington, Virginia. Every weekday began the same way for Mason Rourke. At exactly 5 o'clock, the 44-year-old father quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the only family he had left. The silence of the house was something he had never truly become accustomed to. 6 years had passed since his wife Rachel had lost her life in a highway accident while returning home from an aerospace engineering conference. Yet every morning, Mason still found himself glancing toward the empty side of the bedroom before remembering reality. He no longer mourned with tears. Grief had settled into something quieter, something heavier carried not in his eyes, but in every habit he had built to keep moving forward. He brewed coffee, prepared scrambled eggs, sliced fresh strawberries, packed a lunchbox decorated with tiny airplanes, and carefully folded a handwritten note into Emma's backpack. Every note ended exactly the same way. "Be kind. Be brave. Love, Dad." It was a tradition Rachel had started when Emma was only 4 years old, and Mason had never allowed a single school day to pass without continuing it. To him, routines were more than routines. They were promises. Promises that even after death had stolen half of their family, the remaining half would never stop trying to live with purpose. Upstairs, 11-year-old Emma slowly opened her bedroom door, rubbing sleep from her eyes while clutching the faded stuffed rabbit her mother had given her before her first day of kindergarten. "Morning, Dad," she mumbled. Mason smiled the reserved smile that only appeared when he looked at his daughter. "Breakfast is ready, kiddo." Emma sat across from him, noticing that he had once again burned one corner of the toast. She laughed softly. "You know, Mom always said toast isn't supposed to be charcoal," Mason chuckled. "I keep making it that way so you'll have something to complain about." The joke was repeated dozens of times over the years, but Emma laughed every single morning anyway. They had both learned that laughter could keep sadness from becoming permanent. As Emma ate, she reached into her backpack and pulled out yesterday's science project, a carefully assembled model airplane built from lightweight wood and plastic. "Mrs. Harper said mine had the strongest wing design," she said proudly. Mason examined the tiny aircraft with genuine admiration. Rachel would have loved this moment. She had once dreamed of designing aircraft capable of saving lives during humanitarian missions, and Emma seemed to have inherited every ounce of her mother's curiosity. "See this?" Mason pointed to a miniature fastener securing the wing. "Most people would never notice it." Emma nodded. "It's just a little bolt." Mason smiled gently. "There are no just little bolts on an airplane. Every part has a purpose. Even the smallest piece can protect someone's life." Emma repeated the sentence almost automatically. She had heard it hundreds of times growing up. Every bolt has a purpose. Mason looked at her with quiet pride. Exactly. After dropping Emma at Jefferson Elementary, Mason climbed into his aging blue pickup truck. The dashboard displayed nearly 300,000 miles, and the engine protested every cold morning before finally coming to life. Several coworkers often teased him about driving a truck older than many of the company's interns. Mason never cared. The truck still worked just as he did. He arrived at Titan Dynamics before most executives had even left their homes. The sprawling defense manufacturing complex stretched across dozens of acres behind multiple layers of security fencing. Massive hangars housed experimental aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars, while engineers, technicians, and military personnel moved constantly through restricted areas. To outsiders, the company's success was measured in stock prices, billion-dollar contracts, and impressive media presentations. Mason measured it differently. Every aircraft that left the factory represented a pilot trusting strangers with his or her life. That trust, Mason believed, was sacred. His identification badge granted him access to nearly every production line, but unlike senior executives who traveled with assistants and security details, Mason walked the factory floor alone, carrying nothing more than a flashlight, digital calipers, inspection gauges, and a weathered notebook filled with years of handwritten observations. New employees often underestimated him. His plain work shirt, steel-toe boots, and quiet personality made him look more like an aging mechanic than one of the company's most experienced quality inspectors. The misunderstanding never lasted long. Within minutes, they would watch him identify microscopic machining flaws invisible to everyone else. He could detect improperly torqued fasteners by the slightest difference in resistance. He remembered manufacturing tolerances from projects completed over a decade earlier. More impressively, he refused to compromise those standards, regardless of deadlines, politics, or pressure from management. Among factory workers, Mason had earned a nickname few executives ever heard. They called him the last signature. It wasn't because he signed the most paperwork. It was because his signature meant something. If Mason approved a component, mechanics trusted it with their own lives. If he rejected it, nobody questioned his reasons. His reputation had been built one inspection at a time over 20 years without a single confirmed safety failure on any aircraft he had certified. "Morning, Mason," called Luis Ortega, a senior assembly technician tightening hydraulic connections on a prototype surveillance drone. "Heard management wants this one finished by Friday." Mason set down his inspection case and began checking serial numbers. "Then we'd better make sure Friday is enough time." Luis grinned knowingly. "Meaning if it's not ready." Mason finished the sentence without looking up. "It doesn't fly." Luis laughed quietly. "You really don't know how to bend, do you?" Mason paused before answering. "Metal bends. Standards shouldn't." That simple philosophy explained nearly everything about him. Throughout the morning, Mason moved carefully from one inspection station to another. He stopped to explain measurement techniques to younger inspectors, praised technicians who voluntarily corrected tiny mistakes before being asked and never raised his voice even when discovering defects. He believed respect produced better workmanship than fear ever could. Workers appreciated that. Managers often found it frustrating. Shortly before lunch, Mason entered Hangar 7 where Titan Dynamics' newest unmanned reconnaissance aircraft was nearing completion. Engineers crowded around computer terminals while production supervisors discussed delivery schedules. One conversation immediately caught Mason's attention. "We can't afford another delay," one manager whispered. "Corporate promised the Defense Department demonstration this month." Another replied, "Quality keeps slowing us down." Mason pretended not to hear as he continued his inspection, but the words settled heavily in his mind. He had heard similar complaints more frequently during the past year. Something inside the company had begun changing. Decisions once based on engineering discipline were increasingly driven by financial calendars and investor expectations. Safety meetings became shorter while marketing presentations became longer. Experienced technicians quietly retired or transferred elsewhere, replaced by younger employees pressured to produce faster rather than better. Mason recognized the pattern because he had witnessed it before at another contractor decades earlier, shortly before a catastrophic mechanical failure destroyed an entire test program. He had hoped Titan Dynamics would never repeat those mistakes. Standing alone beside the nearly completed aircraft, Mason gently rested one hand against its polished fuselage. The smooth aluminum reflected the bright overhead lights like a mirror. Somewhere beyond those factory walls, a future pilot would eventually place absolute faith in this machine without ever knowing the names of the people who had built it. That anonymous trust carried enormous weight. Mason never forgot it, not for a single inspection, not for a single signature, and certainly not for a single bolt. Unbeknownst to him, however, forces far above the factory floor had already begun making decisions that would soon test every principle he had lived by, placing his career, his reputation, and perhaps countless lives on a collision course with the ambitions of those who believed deadlines and profits mattered more than doing what was right. By early afternoon, the steady rhythm of the production floor had become almost musical. Robotic arms welded titanium frames with perfect synchronization, while automated guided vehicles carried precision-machined components from one assembly station to another. Sparks flashed beneath enormous ventilation hoods. Engineers studied digital blueprints projected onto transparent displays, and quality inspectors moved methodically between workstations recording measurements that most people would never understand. To visitors, Titan Dynamics looked like the future of American aerospace manufacturing. To Mason Rourke, it looked like a place where one overlooked detail could erase years of brilliant engineering in a single catastrophic second. He often reminded younger inspectors that airplanes did not fail because of dramatic mistakes. They failed because of tiny ones that everyone assumed someone else had already checked. That philosophy had guided his entire career, and it explained why he inspected every aircraft as though his own daughter would one day be sitting inside it. Around 1 o'clock, Mason entered the quality verification lab, where dozens of completed components waited for final approval before being installed into military aircraft. Several junior inspectors immediately looked up as he walked in. "Mr. Rourke," one of them called, "could you take a look at this actuator housing? The measurements are technically within tolerance, but something feels off." Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the component, rotated it slowly beneath the inspection light, then ran his fingertips across one edge with remarkable sensitivity. After nearly 30 seconds of silence, he pointed to a barely visible machining mark. "The cutter vibrated during the final pass," he explained calmly. "It's still inside tolerance, but repeated stress could create a fatigue point after thousands of flight cycles. Reject it." The young inspector stared in disbelief. "You found that just by touching it?" Mason smiled faintly. "Machines leave fingerprints. You just have to learn how to read them." Moments later, the part was sent back for remanufacturing. No one complained. In fact, several technicians thanked him. They knew replacing a single part inside the factory cost thousands of dollars. Replacing it after an aircraft entered service could cost lives. That was why the people on the factory floor trusted Mason more than anyone else in the company. They knew he never rejected work to prove authority or embarrass anyone. He rejected it because he believed every technician deserved the chance to send out something they could be proud of. During the afternoon break, Mason carried a cup of black coffee into the employee cafeteria. Conversations immediately quieted as several workers waved him toward their table. "Come sit with us," Luis Ortega called. "We're trying to settle an argument." Mason raised an eyebrow. "That usually means someone wants me to be the bad guy." Laughter spread across the table. A young engineer named Derek leaned forward. "We're arguing about whether quality inspectors should have the authority to stop production." Mason considered the question before answering. "What do you think production exists for?" Derek shrugged. "To build aircraft." Mason shook his head gently. "No, production exists to build safe aircraft. If safety disappears, production loses its purpose." Another technician nodded immediately. "Exactly what I've been saying." Derek sighed dramatically. "You always ruin my arguments with logic." Mason chuckled, taking a sip of coffee. "No, Derek. Physics ruins arguments. It doesn't care about opinions." The table laughed again, but everyone understood the truth hidden beneath the joke. Gravity, stress, heat, vibration, none of them negotiated. Engineering was built on facts, not optimism. Unfortunately, Mason had begun noticing that not everyone inside Titan Dynamics still believed that. Across the cafeteria behind a glass conference room overlooking the factory floor, several senior executives conducted a meeting that contrasted sharply with the conversations happening below. Charts showing production targets filled massive digital screens, while quarterly revenue projections occupied another wall. Cassandra Whitmore, the company's 41-year-old CEO, stood confidently at the center of the room. Elegant, intelligent, and relentlessly ambitious, she had transformed Titan Dynamics into one of the fastest-growing defense contractors in America. Investors admired her aggressive leadership. Financial news networks regularly praised her as the future of the defense industry. Inside the company, however, opinions were more divided. Cassandra rarely visited the production floor unless cameras followed her. She spoke fluently about shareholder value market expansion and contract acquisition. Yet many veteran engineers quietly questioned whether she truly understood the culture of aerospace safety. To her, delays represented lost opportunities. To Mason, delays often represented disasters prevented. Those two philosophies had not yet collided directly, but everyone who had worked long enough inside Titan Dynamics sensed they eventually would. Standing beside Cassandra was Victor Sloan, the company's procurement director. Unlike Mason, Victor wore expensive tailored suits instead of work boots. He rarely smiled unless influential clients were watching, and his conversations almost always revolved around budget supplier negotiations and cost reductions. On paper, Victor had saved Titan Dynamics tens of millions of dollars by streamlining purchasing operations. His reports consistently impressed the board of directors. What very few people realized was that Victor viewed quality standards as obstacles rather than safeguards. Every specification represented additional expense. Every inspection represented another opportunity for delays. Looking through the conference room glass toward the factory floor, Victor noticed Mason talking with technicians. "There he is again," Victor muttered. Cassandra barely glanced up. "Who?" "Rourke." Cassandra recognized the name immediately. "The inspector." Victor nodded. "He rejects more parts than anyone in the department." Cassandra closed a financial report and frowned slightly. "Does he reject them unnecessarily?" Victor hesitated just long enough to avoid making a direct accusation. "Let's just say he's extremely conservative. Meaning he treats every scratch like a national emergency." Several executives laughed quietly. Cassandra joined them with a polite smile. "People like that have their place," she said. "But they also need to understand that perfection isn't always practical." Victor nodded in agreement, though his expression concealed something far more calculating. "The Defense Department demonstration is less than 2 weeks away. If quality keeps slowing production, we'll have serious problems." Cassandra crossed her arms. "Then tell quality to become part of the solution instead of the problem." Those words were spoken casually before the meeting continued, yet they lingered in Victor's mind. He interpreted them not as a suggestion, but as permission. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the conversation taking place above him, Mason returned to the production floor. His phone vibrated gently. A text message from Emma appeared on the screen beside a photograph of her science fair ribbon. "Guess who got first place?" Beneath the message was a smiling selfie with blue paint still on her fingers from finishing her airplane model. Mason couldn't help smiling. He typed back immediately. "I never doubted you for a second." Ice cream after school. 3 bouncing heart emojis appeared almost instantly. That simple exchange erased the tension of the workday, if only for a moment. Everything Mason did, the long hours, the endless inspections, the refusal to compromise, was ultimately for Emma. He wanted her to grow up believing that integrity was not something people talked about during speeches. Integrity was something they practiced when nobody was watching. Late that afternoon, before leaving for the day, Mason completed one final walk through Hangar 7. Workers were already preparing tomorrow's assembly schedule, while supervisors checked progress against increasingly aggressive deadlines. Mason paused beside the unfinished prototype and quietly reviewed another stack of inspection reports. Everything appeared routine, yet he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in the back of his mind. Tiny inconsistencies had begun appearing more frequently over the past several months. Missing documentation. Suppliers he didn't recognize. Parts arriving with incomplete traceability records before somehow receiving last-minute approval. None of the issues alone justified sounding an alarm, but together they formed a pattern that troubled him deeply. Experience had taught Mason that major disasters rarely announced themselves with obvious warning signs. They whispered first. They hid inside paperwork shortcuts and assumptions. They waited patiently until enough people stopped paying attention. As he switched off his inspection light and closed his notebook for the evening, Mason looked one last time at the aircraft resting silently beneath the hangar lights. He had no way of knowing that within days, one tiny piece of metal buried deep inside a prototype would force him to choose between protecting his career and protecting lives. A choice that would expose secrets powerful people had spent years making sure no honest inspector would ever discover. The following morning began like countless others inside Hangar 7, yet Mason Rourke sensed an unusual urgency the moment he stepped onto the production floor. Supervisors moved briskly between workstations with clipboards in hand, engineers hurried through final software checks, and cleaning crews polished every visible surface until the prototype reconnaissance aircraft gleamed beneath the overhead lights. Tomorrow's demonstration for senior Defense Department officials had become the company's highest priority. Television crews had already scheduled interviews, investors were arriving from New York, and executives spoke confidently about the billion-dollar contract that would soon be secured. Everywhere Mason looked, people seemed focused on appearances, deadlines, and celebration. Very few seemed focused on the aircraft itself. Carrying his inspection kit, Mason reported to the final quality verification station, where the prototype awaited its last approval before flight testing. Company procedure required one final inspection of every safety-critical component before the official release certificate could be signed. It was a process Mason had performed hundreds of times throughout his career, and he approached it with the same discipline, regardless of how much pressure surrounded the project. He slowly reviewed electronic maintenance records, verified torque specifications, checked serial numbers against procurement documents, and physically examined critical structural connections one by one. Nearly everything matched perfectly until he reached the mounting assembly connecting the aircraft's primary flight control actuator. Something immediately caught his attention. It wasn't obvious enough for anyone else to notice, but after 2 decades inspecting military aircraft, Mason's eyes instinctively recognized details others overlooked. He leaned closer beneath his inspection light and removed a magnifying loupe from his pocket. The bolt securing the actuator carried the wrong surface finish. Instead of the dull phosphate coating required under military specifications, the metal reflected a brighter commercial zinc plating. His expression hardened. He carefully removed the installation cover and examined the tiny manufacturer markings engraved around the bolt head. They were unmistakable. The part had been produced by a civilian hardware supplier rather than an approved military contractor. Mason immediately retrieved the engineering specifications from his tablet. The aircraft required a certified mil-spec titanium fastener capable of surviving extreme vibration, rapid temperature changes, and repeated high-load stress. The installed bolt was an ordinary commercial-grade steel fastener worth barely $1. Under normal industrial conditions, it might function adequately, but inside a military aircraft operating under combat-level stress, it represented a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. Mason checked the documentation again, convinced there had to be some mistake. Every procurement record claimed the correct military fastener had been installed. Every inventory barcode matched approved specifications. Yet the physical evidence resting in front of him told a completely different story. Someone had deliberately substituted the certified component with a commercial replacement while falsifying the records to hide the change. His heartbeat slowed rather than accelerated. Years of experience had taught him that panic solved nothing. Facts did. He photographed the bolt from multiple angles, recorded its serial markings, measured its dimensions, and documented every observation before calling the assembly supervisor. Within minutes, several engineers gathered around the inspection station. "What's the issue?" one asked impatiently. Mason held up the bolt. "This aircraft contains a commercial fastener where a military-certified component is required." The supervisor frowned. "It's only one bolt." Mason looked directly into his eyes. "It's one bolt securing a flight control actuator. If it fractures under load, the control surface can separate. If the control surface separates, the aircraft becomes uncontrollable. If the aircraft becomes uncontrollable, the pilot dies." The room fell silent. Before anyone could respond, Victor Sloan entered the hangar accompanied by several senior managers. He immediately sensed the growing tension. "What's delaying final approval?" he demanded. Mason calmly handed him the inspection report. Victor barely glanced at the photographs before shrugging dismissively. "Replace it after today's demonstration." Mason shook his head. "No demonstration. The aircraft is grounded until every critical fastener is verified." Victor's expression darkened. "Do you understand how many people are arriving tomorrow?" "I understand exactly how many lives could depend on this aircraft." Victor lowered his voice. "You're creating a crisis over a $1 bolt." Mason answered without hesitation. "No. Someone else created the crisis by installing it." Within 30 minutes, the disagreement reached the executive floor. Cassandra Whitmore arrived, surrounded by assistants, legal advisors, public relations staff, and several Defense Department representatives touring the facility ahead of the demonstration. She listened impatiently while Victor summarized the situation, carefully describing Mason as an overly cautious inspector threatening to derail months of preparation because of what he called a minor procurement discrepancy. Cassandra stepped toward the inspection table and picked up the tiny bolt between two perfectly manicured fingers. "This," she asked with visible disbelief, "this is what's stopping a billion-dollar program." Mason met her gaze without the slightest hesitation. "No, Ms. Whitmore. What stops the program is the decision to replace a military-grade fastener with a commercial one and then falsify the documentation." A few engineers exchanged nervous glances. Cassandra placed the bolt back onto the table and crossed her arms. "Mr. Rourke, we have government officials flying in from Washington media coverage beginning tomorrow morning and contractual deadlines that cannot be moved. I need your signature releasing this aircraft." Mason slid the inspection report back toward himself and calmly closed the folder. "Then you'll need another inspector because I won't sign a document I know is false." Cassandra's confident smile disappeared. For the first time since becoming CEO, someone inside her company had openly refused a direct order, and the confrontation was only beginning. The silence inside Hangar 7 lasted only a few seconds before Cassandra Whitmore's composure gave way to visible irritation. She looked from the tiny steel bolt in Mason Rourke's hand to the dozens of executives, military representatives, and journalists who had gathered for what was supposed to be a triumphant media preview. Cameras were already recording promotional footage, and several reporters sensed that something unexpected was unfolding. Cassandra knew she could not allow a senior quality inspector to undermine months of carefully orchestrated publicity. Straightening her tailored navy suit, she stepped toward Mason with the confident smile that had impressed investors for years. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "innovation has always attracted people who fear progress. Unfortunately, even inside successful companies, there are individuals who mistake unnecessary caution for professionalism." A few uncomfortable laughs echoed through the room. Mason remained perfectly still. He neither defended himself nor looked away. Cassandra continued holding the commercial bolt between her fingers as though it were nothing more than an insignificant screw picked up from the floor. "Mr. Rourke believes this $1 piece of hardware should delay a program that has already passed multiple engineering reviews and represents more than $1 billion in national defense investment." She turned toward the visiting Defense Department officials. "Fortunately, Titan Dynamics employs hundreds of brilliant engineers who understand the difference between real risk and exaggerated fear." Every word was carefully chosen to isolate Mason without directly accusing him of incompetence, yet the message was unmistakable. The room gradually shifted its attention away from the evidence and toward the man holding it. One reporter quietly whispered to another, while television cameras focused on Mason's expression, hoping to capture embarrassment or anger. They found neither. His face remained calm, almost emotionless, the same expression he wore during every inspection. Colonel Nathan Brooks, the senior Defense Department representative, finally spoke. "Mr. Rourke, are you formally refusing to certify this aircraft?" Mason answered without hesitation. "Yes, Colonel. I cannot approve an aircraft containing a commercial fastener where military specifications require a certified structural component. My responsibility is to protect the people who will eventually fly it, not the company's schedule." Before Brooks could ask another question, Cassandra interrupted. "Then your responsibility ends today." The words struck the room with almost physical force. She turned toward the Director of Human Resources, who had been standing quietly near the entrance. "Effective immediately, Mason Rourke is relieved of all inspection duties for refusing to perform the responsibilities of his position and for obstructing a federally contracted defense program." Gasps spread through the crowd. Several technicians lowered their heads in disbelief. Luis Ortega instinctively took a step forward but stopped when another supervisor placed a hand on his shoulder. Mason looked around the hangar one final time. Many of the workers who had spent years earning his respect could barely meet his eyes. They knew exactly what had happened. He was not being dismissed for incompetence. He was being punished for refusing to compromise. A security officer approached with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Rourke, I'm sorry." Mason offered a faint smile. "You're just doing your job." He removed his company identification badge, placed it beside the unsigned inspection report, and carefully picked up the small cardboard box containing his personal belongings. Before leaving, he quietly placed the commercial bolt on top of the report. "Don't lose this," he said. "It may become the most expensive dollar this company has ever tried to save." Without another word, he walked through the enormous hangar doors while dozens of cameras followed him. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the factory windows as Mason loaded the cardboard box into the back of his aging pickup truck. For the first time in 20 years, he drove away from Titan Dynamics without knowing whether he would ever return. That evening, Emma opened the front door before he could reach it. "You're home early," she said cheerfully, but her smile slowly faded when she noticed the cardboard box in his arms. "Dad, what happened?" Mason set the box gently on the kitchen table. "I lost my job." Emma stared at him in silence. "Did you make a mistake?" He knelt beside her until they were eye level. "No." "Then why did they fire you?" Mason looked toward the framed photograph of Rachel sitting above the fireplace. "Because sometimes telling the truth is more expensive than telling people what they want to hear." Emma wrapped her arms tightly around him without asking another question. She had grown up watching her father choose honesty over convenience every single day. If he believed he had done the right thing, that was enough for her. 3 days later, under clear blue skies, Titan Dynamics welcomed government officials, investors, and national media to the highly anticipated flight demonstration. Cassandra stood confidently before television cameras, describing the aircraft as a revolutionary advancement in American defense technology. Behind her, the prototype taxied smoothly toward the runway, while applause filled the observation platform. Victor Sloan smiled comfortably beside the board of directors. Everything appeared perfect. As the engines roared to full power, the aircraft accelerated down the runway before lifting gracefully into the air. Cheers erupted as it climbed higher above the factory. For the first several minutes, every maneuver unfolded exactly as planned. The pilot reported flawless handling while live telemetry streamed across giant display screens. Cassandra exchanged satisfied glances with investors convinced that Mason's warnings had already been forgotten. Then, just over 11 minutes into the flight, one engineer monitoring structural load data suddenly frowned. A warning indicator flashed red. Another alarm followed almost immediately. Inside the aircraft, violent vibrations began spreading through the primary flight control assembly. Before anyone could understand what was happening, a sharp metallic crack echoed through the cockpit. The pilot shouted an emergency transmission as one of the control surfaces stopped responding. On the ground, hundreds of spectators watched in horror as the aircraft rolled violently to one side. Smoke burst from the fuselage before the prototype entered an uncontrollable dive. Seconds later, a bright orange fireball erupted across a remote test field several miles beyond the runway. The explosion silenced the entire observation area. The only reason the disaster claimed no life was because the experienced test pilot managed to activate the ejection seat moments before impact. Emergency crews raced toward the crash site while stunned executives stood frozen in disbelief. Cassandra's confident expression disappeared completely as television cameras captured every second live across the country. By sunset, federal investigators had secured the wreckage. The Defense Department announced an immediate suspension of all acceptance testing, and every remaining Titan Dynamics aircraft scheduled for delivery was grounded pending inspection. Less than 24 hours later, the Department of Defense formally froze the company's $1.2 billion contract, while federal agencies launched a full investigation into procurement records, quality certifications, and possible fraud. As investigators began collecting maintenance logs and rejected inspection reports, one name appeared repeatedly throughout the documentation: the quality inspector who had warned everyone before the aircraft ever left the ground. Within 48 hours of the crash, Titan Dynamics transformed from one of America's most celebrated defense contractors into the center of a federal investigation. FBI agents, Defense Criminal Investigative Service officers, Department of Defense auditors, and procurement specialists filled conference rooms that had once hosted investor presentations. Every computer server was secured, every purchasing record was frozen, and every employee involved with the prototype program was instructed not to leave the state without notifying investigators. The media that had praised Cassandra Whitmore only days earlier now broadcast continuous coverage questioning how a state-of-the-art military aircraft had failed during a routine demonstration. As investigators reconstructed the wreckage, metallurgical analysis quickly confirmed Mason Rourke's original conclusion. The fractured fastener recovered from the flight control assembly was not manufactured to military specifications. It was an ordinary commercial-grade bolt that had failed under stress levels. The certified component was specifically designed to survive. More troubling still, laboratory tests revealed that the bolt had never undergone the heat treatment fatigue testing or traceability requirements demanded for defense applications. Someone had knowingly installed an unqualified part inside an aircraft intended for military service. Colonel Nathan Brooks immediately ordered investigators to retrieve every inspection report connected to the program. Among thousands of digital records, one document immediately stood out. Mason Rourke's unsigned certification report, complete with photographs, measurements, serial numbers, and a written warning stating that the aircraft should not be flown until the fastener had been replaced and every related component verified. Timestamps proved the report had been submitted before the demonstration. Security camera footage confirmed that Mason had presented the evidence directly to senior management. Even more damaging was the archived surveillance video showing Cassandra publicly demanding that Mason approve the aircraft despite his objections. The investigation widened rapidly. Federal auditors compared procurement invoices with supplier shipments, inventory databases, warehouse logs, and bank transactions spanning nearly 4 years. The deeper they searched, the more disturbing the pattern became. Hundreds of military-certified components listed in official purchasing records had never actually reached the assembly floor. Instead, lower-cost commercial parts had quietly replaced them while documentation was altered to conceal the substitutions. The price differences had been diverted through shell suppliers controlled by individuals connected to Procurement Director Victor Sloan. What initially appeared to be a single defective bolt soon exposed a sophisticated fraud scheme worth tens of millions of dollars. Every forged signature, every altered invoice, and every falsified inspection trail pointed toward the same procurement network. Faced with overwhelming evidence, several purchasing managers accepted plea agreements and began cooperating with federal prosecutors. Their testimony described years of pressure to reduce manufacturing costs, regardless of engineering requirements. They admitted that Victor repeatedly assured them quality inspectors would never discover the substitutions because documentation would always match the original specifications. One witness revealed that whenever inspectors questioned inconsistencies, records were quietly corrected before formal audits occurred. Mason's discovery had shattered a system that had operated undetected for years. 3 weeks after the crash, FBI agents entered Titan Dynamics headquarters shortly after sunrise. Employees watched through office windows as Victor Sloan was escorted from the executive floor in handcuffs, facing multiple federal charges, including procurement fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, falsification of defense records, and endangering military personnel. News helicopters captured the arrest live as reporters described the dramatic collapse of one of the industry's most respected executives. Victor avoided every camera, his confidence finally replaced by silence. Cassandra Whitmore was not charged with participating in the fraud itself, but the investigation concluded that she had ignored documented safety concerns, retaliated against a protected employee, failed to enforce required compliance procedures, and placed delivery schedules ahead of mandatory certification standards. Under intense pressure from the Board of Directors and the Department of Defense, she resigned as Chief Executive Officer before the company's annual shareholders meeting. Standing before reporters outside corporate headquarters, Cassandra accepted responsibility for the culture that had developed under her leadership. "I believed meeting deadlines demonstrated strength," she admitted quietly. "I failed to understand that true leadership begins with protecting the people who trust your decisions." It was the first genuinely humble statement many employees had ever heard from her. Meanwhile, Mason Rourke had spent the previous month at home searching for another job while helping Emma prepare for her middle school science competition. He had no expectation that anyone from Washington would ever contact him again. Then one quiet Tuesday morning, a black government vehicle stopped outside his house. Colonel Nathan Brooks stepped onto the porch carrying a leather folder. Mason invited him inside, assuming more questions remained about the investigation. Instead, Brooks extended his hand. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "on behalf of the Department of Defense, I'd like to apologize. You tried to prevent this tragedy and we failed to listen." Mason accepted the handshake without triumph. "The pilot survived. That's what matters." Brooks smiled. "He survived because he had enough altitude to eject. Next time we may not be so fortunate." Opening the folder, Brooks presented an official appointment letter offering Mason the position of Senior Defense Safety Advisor, responsible for strengthening inspection procedures across multiple military aviation programs. The recommendation had been unanimously approved after investigators concluded that his integrity had likely prevented future catastrophes across the defense industry. Mason remained silent for several moments before finally accepting the letter. It was never the recognition he had wanted. The only thing he had ever wanted was for someone to take safety seriously. Months later, new federal regulations required expanded traceability for every safety-critical component used in defense aircraft, while independent quality inspectors received additional legal protections against retaliation for refusing unsafe certifications. Across the industry, engineers quietly referred to the reforms as the Rourke Standard. At Emma's school science fair that spring, students displayed robots, rockets, and renewable energy projects throughout the gymnasium. Emma's exhibit attracted unusual attention. Resting beside her carefully constructed aircraft model was a simple glass display case containing an ordinary steel bolt donated by federal investigators after the trial concluded. Above it hung a handwritten title, "The $1 Bolt That Saved Thousands of Lives." When the judges asked why such an ordinary piece of metal deserved its own display, Emma smiled proudly toward her father standing quietly in the back of the room. "Because my dad taught me that nothing on an airplane is ever just a bolt," she answered. "Every part has a purpose, and every person has a responsibility to tell the truth, even when everyone else wants them to stay quiet." Mason felt his eyes fill for the first time since Rachel's funeral. He realized that his greatest achievement had never been exposing corruption or helping reform the defense industry. It was raising a daughter who understood that character is measured not by promotions, wealth, or applause, but by the courage to protect strangers you may never meet. As father and daughter walked home beneath the evening sky, a military transport aircraft crossed silently overhead, carrying service members toward missions they would never know. Mason watched it disappear beyond the horizon with quiet satisfaction. Somewhere inside that aircraft were thousands of bolts, each one installed by people entrusted with lives they would never personally see. Most passengers would never think about those tiny pieces of metal, and that was exactly how it should be. Because when honest people refuse to compromise, the smallest $1 bolt can become the invisible difference between tragedy and every safe journey home.